Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Noswitha Ihigid. This is the 7th in the annual academic eco-criticism competition, a partnership between the Hay Festival, ASLE-UK and Inspire at UWTSD. And since we all use so many acronyms, I better unpack that for you a little bit. So the University of Wales Trinity St David has an Institute of Sustainable Practice, Innovation and Resource Effectiveness, which I've run for a number of years. And I'm delighted that this lecture, in collaboration with the Hay Festival, is also in collaboration with the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, UK and Ireland. And ASLE-UK was founded in 1988, and it aims to represent and support scholars and writers in the Atlantic archipelago and beyond who are interested in the environment and the expression and the cultural imagination. And I'm particularly delighted, on behalf of ASLE-UK, to be joined by its chair, Professor Brachan Carey, Professor of English at Northumbria University. Now, the aim of this lecture is to give literary scholars the chance to engage with the idea of sustainability by writing a public lecture which pursues literary study in the light of sustainability issues. Hence, appropriately, the winning prize is the chance to give the lecture here at the Hay Festival and get a chance to discuss it afterwards. Each year, it is an enormous pleasure to engage with talented artists interested in nature and the environment, who bring us new understandings due to their exceptional facility with words. And the competition enables you, as visitors to Hay, to witness the extraordinary talent that lies in our universities and create an opportunity, I hope, for new academic engagement. We're really looking forward to exploring what lies behind this year's winning lecture. So without further ado, I'm very keen to introduce Dr. Catherine Charlwood, a young scholar who works with the Diseases of Modern Life project at the University of Oxford. Her research there concerns the opium-containing soothing syrup Godfrey's cordial, which was responsible for the death of countless Victorian infants in the 19th century. With Godfrey's mentioned across medical journals, social criticism, parliamentary reports, novels, ballads, national and regional newspapers and more, including in the lecture you're about to hear, she is tracing the rise in awareness of Godfrey's, as well as the ways in which it reveals gender biases, mothers and nurses are usually blamed, class assumptions, drugging infants is a practice associated with the working classes, the split between druggists, chemists and doctors, and the difficulty of legislating against a substance, even when it is known to be fatal. Now, Catherine grew up in Leicestershire and has always loved trees. And the first tree name she remembers learning was a silver birch because of the 3 in the front garden of her home. And clearly that love of trees has influenced the choices in terms of her career. She is currently completing a book-length study of Hardy and Frost. She's a Fulbright scholar and a former teacher, and she also co-hosts Lit Sci Pod, the literature and science podcast. So welcome all to the 7th annual Hay ASLE Inspire lecture, Such a Pair, the Twin Lives of Human and Trees. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Catherine Charlwood.
Perhaps it's no surprise that I've taken trees as my topic for this lecture. I joke with family and friends that I know I'm falling to depression when I stop noticing the beauty of the trees around me. Does anyone else here decide on a favourite tree when they move to a new place? Yes. Good. If not, try it. It helps you feel, and I intend the pun, though mean this seriously, rooted. Trees sustain my mental well-being in a very personal way, but of course trees sustain human lives and habitations in their production of oxygen through photosynthesis, GCSE biology came in handy after all, and in providing shade from sun and shelter from rain. This is already sounding like a very human-centred or anthropocentric version of a tree's existence, but what I want to explore with you today are poems in which the lives of trees and those of humans are paired, are brought together. Literature and poetry in particular shows a sustained interest in trees spanning centuries. I'm going to argue that in tying human lives to tree lives, poetry promotes a mutually sustaining model of relation and reliance. Perhaps trees need us as much as we need them, especially to advocate on their behalf. Perhaps it is only when a tree life is valued like a human life that nature doesn't suffer. Other writers will feature, but primarily I want to talk with you about how trees pervade the poetry of Thomas Hardy and Charlotte Mew, and I want to consider three ideas. The paralleling of plant and person, the way that tree felling is represented in poetry, and moments when the distinction between the human body and the tree's form starts to fade. Note the disclaimer. So we seem to enjoy striking up relationships, even if they may be imagined, with the natural world. American poet Robert Frost wrote, "Tree at my window, window tree, my sash is lowered when night comes on, but let there never be curtain drawn between you and me." You and me form a neat pair, just as the stanza form brings them back together through the arch rhyme of ABBA, with further sonic linking through the internal rhyme of never be. Even the first line alone offers some sense of reflective relationships. The chiasmus or mirroring effect of moving from tree to window, window to tree, makes this an expected and reciprocal sight. For Thomas Hardy, a poet Frost was inspired by, trees were beings that humans not just lived alongside, but who shared their life experiences. The tree, an old man's story, hears its speaker saddened that a storm has demolished the tree underneath which was the main location for a thwarted love affair. Nothing ends happily ever after in Thomas Hardy, not even for the trees. Its roots are bristling in the air, like some mad earth god's spiny hair. The loud southwesters swell and yell smote it at midnight, and it fell. Thus ends the tree where someone sat with me. The speaker values the tree for what happened there, rather than for its innate properties, yet there's sincere distress over its upturned circumstances. Roots should bristle at being in the air, because it's an unnatural placement for them. The speaker spends the larger part of the stanza reflecting on the tree's loss, rather than his own, with the second stanza noting that its boughs, which none but darers trod, a child may step on from the sod, and twigs that earliest met the dawn are lit the last upon the lawn. What was above human heads is now found underfoot, and the speaker meditates on the precise qualities of the tree's former quotidian routine in thinking through how it would previously have received sunlight first. Yes, this detail may be remembered because his amorous experiences there rendered it personally meaningful, but the tree is still being individually remembered as part of the old man's life. Now, while the tree of the old man's story was a tree of romantic assignations, the way trees are tied to human lives in Hardy's poems usually comes into focus after death. In The 6 Boards, the speaker imagines the progress of the 6 boards of tree wood, which will eventually form his coffin. What is odd, or one of the things that's odd, is that this relationship only comes to fruition after both of their deaths. In life, they live parallel existences, unaware of each other's presence, but the final 2 stanzas bring them together in a projected future. Those boards and I, how much in common we of feel and touch shall share thence on, earth's far core quakings, hill shocks, tide shakings. Tree and man, the partnership of the last stanza, become a common we, appearing even to share a nervous system after death. And yet death offers both parties a removal from the mundane hurt of the world. While in the 6 boards, a tree is paired with a man, in the felled elm and she, clues in the title, it's a woman. And you get these wonderful couplets where one is about the woman and one is about the tree. So this time, the relationship is a constant throughout both their lives, though unknowingly, from being that inmost ring and a little thing together. Rather than the ownership, which begins the 6 boards, where 6 boards belong to me, this poem foregrounds the tree's existence to which the humans can be compared. She, like you, was a little thing. the tree's decay seems to inspire a consequential decline in the woman's health, leading to a transfer between them. When you were quite hollow within, she was felled. She dies first, and by a verb usually reserved for trees. And then the comparison reverses. The tree dies, matching her, both unaware that your lives form such a pair. Now, I'm not saying that this is realistic, nor that we each have a destined tree awaiting us, a little bit creepy, but that it's fascinating how insistently Hardy ties human fortunes to those of trees, and in doing so elevates the status of tree life and brings it to our attention. So, as was mentioned, I work on a project called The Diseases of Modern Life at the University of Oxford, and it looks at medical, literary and cultural responses in the Victorian age to perceived problems of stress and overwork. But one huge change during the Industrial Revolution, which affected public health, was urban expansion, with all its attendant smoke and pollution, and the consequential pruning back of the natural world. Charlotte Mew lived in London all her life, and Thomas Hardy did at various points in his, though he's much more associated with Dorset. And both of these poets saw the effect the growing metropolis was having on London's tree population. While The Trees Are Down memorialises the 1922 destruction of Euston Square Gardens, near Mew's home, there is a related, shorter poem called Domus Caedet Arborum, I had to get a classicist to teach me how to say that, which, thanks to John Newton's notes, I can tell you means the house kills the tree. And you can see that these dark houses are biding their time to further creep into nature. So the anthropomorphised houses here represent mankind's urge to dominate nature. While the poem was likely written in the early 1920s, Mew's essay of 1913, Men and Trees, notes, "In my own neighbourhood, one after another falls. Progress pulls down the old shabby houses and puts up flats for the half-world. The green vanishes." This seems to benefit no one, with humankind not only crowding out nature, but also each other, being crammed into flats rather than spacious, albeit shabby, houses. Hardy also wrote his poem To a Tree in London in the 1920s, but it was collected in his 1928 posthumously published collection Winter Words. And again, the focus is on the ills suffered by the tree, this time in Clement's Inn. Here you stay, night and day, never, never going away. Do you ache when we take holiday for our health's sake? Wish for feet when the heat scalds you in the brick-built street? The speaker clearly sympathises with the tree's plight, stuck as it is in one location, while humans have the advantage of being able to holiday for their health. But the questions of stanzas 2 to 5 lead to the negative answer and elaboration of the final 4. No. You read trees to need smoke like earth whereon to feed. Have no sense that far hence air is sweet in a blue immense. Thus black, blind, you have opined nothing of your brightest kind. Never seen miles of green, smelt the landscape's sweet serene. In this case, the tree suffers not from being threatened with extinction, but through its positioning in a polluted metropolis. This is a tree fed upon smoke, and seemingly in possession of a kind of consciousness, since the sorrow of the poem is that the tree is unaware of the green possibilities for tree life beyond London, stuck as it is being black, blind, a phrase of particular pointless loss in Hardy's verse, since his 1912 poem on the sinking of the Titanic describes the upper-class jewels now lying on the seabed with all their sparkles bleared and black and blind. This tree might not be facing death at humankind's hand, but to have never seen miles of green seems like an unlived, or at least not fully realised life for a tree, and a modern condition born of industrialisation. So I'm now going to consider a group of poems in which the main action is tree felling. But first I want to highlight that Hardy's To a Tree in London comes just before The Felled Elm and She in his final collection Winter Words, with Throwing a Tree appearing a few pages earlier. I don't think this is coincidental, or indeed that surprising. By his death in 1928, Hardy was an 87-year-old man who could see the city's encroachment into nature for the ecological crisis it was becoming. They might not sound it, but these 19th and early 20th century verses are political poems, obdurately and obstinately standing against an economic system which didn't value nature, and which still doesn't today. Hardy's Throwing a Tree was almost certainly informed by all the poems that went before it, and definitely Muse. Throwing suggests action and athleticism, but such as are deadly, since Hardy immediately terms the tree fellers the two executioners. He would have read in Muse Men and Trees essays a conversation with a blind friend who remembers a tree outside the British Museum they were felling last week, with all the instruments of butchery, the axe and the rope and the saw, and the clearing round it like a scaffold. It went on for days, and I didn't altogether care for it. I really can't bear to see a tree cut down, a big tree. It's a sort of sacrilege. This distaste for and distress over tree felling is something that comes out in all of the poems, and see how Hardy's poem mirrors this vision. The two executioners stalk along over the knolls, bearing two axes with heavy hands, heavy heads, shining and wide, and a long, limp, two-handled saw toothed for cutting great boles, and so they approach the proud tree that bears the death mark on its side. Jackets doffed, they swing axes and chop away just above ground, and the chips fly about and lie white on the moss and fallen leaves, till a broad, deep gash in the bark is hewn all the way round, and one of them tries to hook upward a rope, which at last he achieves. The saw then begins, till the top of the tall giant shivers. The shivers are seen to grow greater each cut than before. They edge out the saw, tug the rope, but the tree only quivers, and kneeling and sawing again, they step back to try pulling once more. Then, lastly, the living mast sways, further sways. With a shout, Job and I crush aside. Reached the end of its long-staying powers, the tree crashes downward. It shakes all its neighbours throughout, and 200 years' steady growth has been ended in less than 2 hours. Part of what is offensive in the men's actions is the casualness with which they fell a tall giant. Jackets doffed, they swing axes and chop away. The overly long last line always begins, and the cumulative consequence of their actions come to bear. Hardy leans on the verse form to have the reader witness this felling, till a broad, deep gash in the bark is hewn, sees three heavy stresses all sitting consecutively, the weight of the wound sonically burdening the reader's ear. In its final moments, the tree metaphorically becomes a living mast, an oxymoron, since masts are another use to which men might put dead trees. Hardy has already tried to involve us in the soundscape of tree felling, with swing, chop, sawing, but it is the final stanza which is the noisiest. With a shout, our executioners rush aside, leaving us free to hear the tree fall across the line break, thanks to Hardy's enjambment, only to be finally arrested and silenced by the midline caesura, fancy word for pause. Reached the end of its long-staying powers, the tree crashes downward. Even the stressed, unstressed pattern of downward hears the tree's voice diminishing, unable further to participate. Given that the poem was originally titled Felling a Tree, Frank Pinion is right to suggest that the subject was partly prompted by William Barnes's Vellon the Tree. The first two lines, which are also the last two lines, lay out the predicament. Now I can't do a West Country accent at all, so I'm going to try and read it as read and we'll just see what comes out. Ease. The girt elm tree out in the little home ground where a stallen this marnin and a now's a cut down. I did warn you. Like Hardy's Downward, Barnes emphasises the irreversible change which has taken place through this vellon. The standing tree has become its opposite, a felled one, which is down. One way in which Barnes intensifies the loss is by detailing in the first stanza how well the tree provided for the people around it. For instance, it was where the haymakers put up their picks and their rakes, and did squat down to snabble their cheese and their cakes. The senselessness, then, of the second stanza's violence comes through even more forcefully. A more old-fashioned felling is seen. No axe, no saw, but still the rope. Yet the noises are still frightening. As we ring to Vivromin close at our backs, oh, his boughs come a whizzing and gin sich cracks. Rather than Hardy's crashes, Barnes makes us hear the tree a whizzing through the air, the onomatopoeia of whiz inevitably engendering the sound of its speed into sich cracks. That would resound anyway, but by rhyming it on human backs, Barnes also invites us to think of this tree felling in terms of a broken back, again intensifying the pain heard and imagined. Quite different from Barnes, Gerard Manley Hopkins's Binley Poplars locates itself specifically by the trees it's eulogising. Rather than witnessing the process, this poem concerns the aftermath of a felling. And although we might not hear the destruction as it happens, the poem tolls on the repetition of felled, as if the speaker cannot believe it. It is especially striking given the variety of sound created by the alliteration of fresh and following folded, or the sibilance of sandaled shadow that swam or sank. As John Parham notes in his chapter on what he terms Hopkins's sustainable poetry, sprung rhythm, that is the way that Hopkins organised stresses in his poetry, had a more pragmatic dimension, as a device by which Hopkins would hold society to account for any detrimental alterations to nature, for it enabled him also to portray disruptions to the flow of energy, not least as a result of human activity. An obvious example occurs in Binley Poplars, where a predominantly oral description of the demise of aspen trees is designed to imitate the labourers' blows. And the blows echo on in the poem, resounding through history as a warning. With its abundance of rhyme, this poem is rich, even urgent in sound, yearning for the absent trees. My favourite line contrasts the hard consonants with alliteration, hack and rack the growing green, while hack and rack have hard vowel sounds which are quickly silenced by the voiceless k. Growing and green have longer vowel sounds, with growing the action that gets to be continuous, not hacking or racking. For me at least, there is hope hidden in the poem's sad music. The final tree-felling poem I want to look at is Charlotte Mew's The Trees Are Down, whose title can evoke, beyond the obvious, being dejected, being brought low or humbled. They are cutting down the great plane trees at the end of the gardens. For days there has been the grate of the saw, the swish of the branches as they fall, the crash of the trunks, the rustle of trodden leaves, with the whoops and the woes, the loud common talk, the loud common laughs of the men above it all. Hardy's jacketless executioners, who only shout when the tree is falling, are here outdone by men who whoop and woe as if in celebration, and laugh and talk as if uncaring of the damage they do. Mew's repetition of common, angry though the tone is, sounds to me less of a class statement than a fury that this is all too familiar and happens too frequently. It's similar to Hamlet's resentment when his mother seeks to assuage his grief for his father by pointing out, "Thou know'st 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity." His answer, "Aye, madam, 'tis common," usually delivered with a certain amount of spitting, makes the point that, common or not, this death is important to him. In the case of Mew's poem, though, this is not a natural death, but one willed by the men involved. Her focus on the variety of sounds created forces the reader to experience, though in a stanza, what she has been hearing for days. The opening of the third stanza also places us within the time frame of the felling. Well, that worked. There we go. The short lines barely give the lone bough enough chance to enjoy final moments, but then the next line of the poem confirms what we anticipate. The felling is a real-time experience, enacted by the poem through the line break. Mew similarly makes deft use of enjambment into caesura, though in a way different from Hardy. It is not for a moment the spring is unmade today. These were great trees. It was in them from root to stem. When the men with the whoops and the woes have carted the whole of the whispering loveliness away, half the spring, for me, will have gone with them. The men's loud battle cries are contrasted with the whispering loveliness, which was the natural sound of the trees, and they cart away a sound rather than a physical tree, thanks to Mew's metaphor. Again, it's the oral experience of the tree which is foregrounded, even though it's perhaps the least tangible aspect. Thanks to the lack of punctuation, the trees are carted away beyond the line break, only to be interrupted mid-line, as the line itself is divided up much as the spring is for the speaker. There's a poignancy in the euphemistic phrase, "It is not for a moment the spring is unmade today," because this unmaking is permanent. I mean, I find this quite an astonishing poem, to be honest. In James Henry Leigh Hunt's Lounging Through Kensington, he notes that Kensington Gardens brings to mind's eyes conversant with local biography there, a poet on the greensward, glad to get out of the London smoke and find himself among trees. Leigh Hunt goes on to list the many historical personages who've likely passed through this same space, and sure enough, one eminent figure who was so inspired was Charles Darwin, who, writing in his notebook in 1838, avers, "I am sure I remember my pleasure in Kensington Gardens has often been greatly excited by looking at trees as great compound animals, united in wonderful and mysterious manner." And while I don't have time to go into this, the notion of seeing the natural world as compound animals is crucial to Darwin's vision of nature. So the Kensington trees were part of forming the 19th century imagination in a really important way. Now, while Leigh Hunt makes a historical literary case for the importance of this location, I'm interested in Kensington Gardens as a place of refuge from the London smoke and as somewhere characterised by trees. In 1865, a piece written for the medical journal, The Lancet, on the proposed enclosure of Wimbledon Common, notes that Kensington Gardens, with its magnificent trees, invites the multitude to its shade. So this time it's shade which Kensington Gardens is providing the public, but I'm aiming to show here quite how much this location was known for its trees, so that it has more weight when I reveal that near the start of her essay, Men and Trees 1, Charlotte Mew bemoans how the London trees are all prisoners of men, some unreasonably mutilated like the locked crowd in Greenwich Park, while now and then there is a wholesale massacre such as that of the 700 in Kensington Gardens, which took place no one knows why, some 30 years ago, against which even the executioners protested, and perhaps the homeless rooks as vainly. By calling the trees the 700, Mew recalls Tennyson's famous 1854 poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, with its rousing refrain of "Into the valley of death rode the 600. With this alignment, Mew makes human progress into a war against nature, and a war in which the trees' chances of survival are about as good as those of the soldiers in Tennyson's poem. William Henry Hudson's Birds in London corroborates Mew's claim, noting that some will say in these fast-moving times crowded with historically important events, it is hardly worthwhile in 1898 to recall the fact that in 1880 a grove of 700 trees was cut down in Kensington Garden for no reason whatever. Now this comes from the chapter The Expulsion of the Rooks, in large part because of the destruction of these trees. As Mew's paragraph concerning Kensington closes, even tomorrow one may miss the familiar plain of yesterday, and the birds go with the trees. The reason for it given at the time was that many trees were dangerously unhealthy, yet Hudson himself notes that the truth was those in Kensington Gardens were not dying and not decayed. The very fact that they were chosen year after year by the rooks to build on afforded the strongest evidence that they were the healthiest trees in the garden. Now, the Era, reporting at the time of the felling, in October 1880, puts the destruction in emotive terms, yes, but also highlights the health aspect of removing greenery from the cityscape. Considering the difficulty there is to get trees to grow in the smoky atmosphere of the metropolis, we can but view with deepest regret the almost wholesale destruction of the trees in Kensington Gardens. So the tragedy of Kensington in 1880 is predicated on the notion that cities more than anywhere else need a healthy supply of trees in order to sustain their human population, who otherwise have only the smoky atmosphere of the metropolis to fall back on. And Kensington Gardens remain a point of contention, by the way. In 1889 it starts again, and we have the West London Observer asking who can help being sorry at the havoc which goes on among the sylvan beauties of Kensington Gardens. And by December 1906, the Pall Mall Gazette reports that once again, drastic pruning operations are in action. But to go back to the Era's 1880 article, the column poses an important question. Do the destroyers of the Kensington trees realise how long those splendid trees were growing? It's a question which returns us to Hopkins's Binsey Poplars, written the year before this. The last stanza begins, "Oh, if we but knew what we do when we delve or hew." The unstated implication is, of course, that if we did know, if we did realise, we wouldn't do it. Hardy's Throwing a Tree has its executioners display a marked lack of awareness throughout the poem, and the last line answers the era's question with a frank no, given that 200 years steady growth has been ended in less than 2 hours. Much as the tree collapses, time is made a mockery of, as steady growth is demolished in the name of progress. And as Kim Taplin points out, poetry is more likely to rouse us than statistics. Hardy's line makes us pause. He makes us compare and consider and think why we value trees. Similarly, Charlotte Mew's simple statement that these were great trees might explicitly concern height and physical dominance, but great also denotes age, venerability. Again, the poet is keenly aware of how long those splendid trees were growing, and upset, if not offended, that those felling them didn't consider it. So in the 1906 Pall Mall Gazette report, the Kensington trees appear to borrow bodily form. Not only were a few obviously old and dangerous trees removed bodily, but trees in the full vigour of their youth have been thus mutilated, and now stand like so many skeletons. In pushing the reader towards thinking of these trees in human terms, the harm, the damage, feels more pronounced. And Manly Hopkins figures nature as a woman, so tender to touch, her being so slender, making the destruction akin to assault. Noticeably, near the poem's end, Hopkins writes, "Only 10 or 12 strokes of havoc unselve the sweet especial scene," as if there is a conscious self undone by this tree felling, much as the speaker, her or himself, sounds undone by it. Barnes goes further in Vellon the Tree, since amid the tree felling process, the tree swayed all his limbs and he nodded his head before falling, again figuring this as the destruction of a human body. Noticeably, as the tree comes down, it is the human bodies at risk, as we Rindaway Romin close at our backs, and the tree returns in the next line to having boughs and later a stem, as if the possibility of its humanity only lasts while it is alive. But this also works in reverse. The human body can acquire the tree's likeness. Now, perhaps your torso's never been referred to as a trunk, but I had an overzealous ballet teacher. And it is definition 2A in the Oxford English Dictionary for the noun trunk, the human body without the head, or especially without the head and limbs. And perhaps while in life, human bodies and tree bodies seem largely separate, in poetry, they are never too far from one another. Titus Andronicus, Shakespeare's earliest and bloodiest play, includes possibly the most unlikely and inappropriate reaction to seeing a raped and mutilated woman. Unable to comprehend the scale of damage before him when his niece Lavinia appears on stage, Marcus Andronicus instead understands her as an injured tree. In a misplaced and therefore more distressing aesthetic act, Lavinia, whose tongue has been cut out so she cannot name her tormentors, is urged to speak. What stern ungentle hands have lopped and hewed and made thy body bare of her 2 branches? This is a human body which owns branches, which can embrace rather than arms. Trees are preferable to humans here, since it is hands which have wrought this destruction, but branches which suffer. The same verbs as were used in the tree-felling poems are found: lopped, hewed. These are verbs of tree rather than flesh damage. This long history of the intertwining of tree and human bodies is, in part, what makes the ending of Don Patterson's 2007 poem, sorry, I should put that up earlier, whoops, so disturbing. This man has 2 trees, and then somebody else takes over the house and he separates them. And no, they did not die from solitude, nor did their branches bear a sterile fruit, nor did their unhealed flanks weep every spring for those 4 yards that lost them everything, as each strained on its shackled route to face the other's empty, intricate embrace. They were trees, and trees don't weep or ache or shout, and trees are all this poem is about. The last line in perfect iambic pentameter undoes all that went before. In definitively stating trees are all this poem is about, Patterson plants the seed of doubt and invites the reader to retrospectively re-evaluate the poem in the knowledge that this could be much, much darker. Again, trees are given fleshly form and consciousness, with flanks, the ability to embrace. And it's this nor did they do this, nor did they do that, that really sort of protests too much, and we start to think that maybe all these things did happen. Especially because readers of this poem versed in the long, long life of trees know that trees precisely can weep or ache or shout in Patterson's painful tricolon, because they do just that in the 13th canto of Dante's Inferno. In Dante's vision of hell, people who have committed suicide are transformed into trees and form a wood through which he walks, but it is not a healthy forest. And Dante's confused by his surroundings, since from every side I heard the sound of cries, but no source. And encouraged by his guide Virgil, Dante snaps off a nearby branch to reveal the awful truth. Why do you tear me? So that from broken stump issued together both words and blood. In poetry, trees can weep, ache, shout, and famously bleed in the Inferno, so closely are they tied to human bodies. But to end on a less distressing note than hell, I turn again to Hardy. Yes, that's right, I'm turning to Hardy for something less distressing. Oh, just a quick vision of hell for you before we move on. In a well-known, somewhat avuncular poem, Transformations, dead friends and family are transformed into trees, and by the end of the poem, this notion provides a renewed purchase on life for these deceased persons and a satisfaction for the speaker, since they are not underground, but as nerves and veins abound in the growths of upper air. Tree and human once again form a living pair, with aspects of the human body in their now shared nerves and veins, one organic whole. And another reason to find this an optimistic version of the afterlife is that Hardy himself oversaw the creation of a kind of human-tree hybrid, and you can go and visit the Hardy tree in Old St Pancras Churchyard in London, because as an architectural apprentice, when he oversaw the exhumation and reburial of hundreds of bodies in order to make way for the new London Midland Railway in 1865, Hardy had the gravestones, now separate from their respective remains, paired back to back and placed in concentric circles around what was then a sapling ash tree. In the over 150 years that have passed since this arrangement, not only has the tree become huge, but its roots have grown sort of between the gravestones, so that you couldn't remove the gravestones without damaging the tree. It's the living realisation of the lines in his poem, "I set every tree in my June time, and now they obscure the sky." Tying together human and tree existence through an imaginative linking and the shared form both of poem and body may seem to rely on an overly anthropocentric perspective on which to mount an argument that poetry sustains interest in and care for the trees which sustain our everyday lives. However, the tree-felling poems I've shown demonstrate how well poetry not just documents, but forces the reader to go through the visual and overwhelmingly oral experience of tree destruction, and in doing so, to consider the cost of such sacrifices, and to think about the value of tree lives not just to human lives, but to the shared life the entire planet presumably wants and definitely needs to sustain. Thank you.
You'll be bursting bursting with questions.
I'm always bursting with questions. Thank you so much, Catherine, for such a fascinating and beautifully delivered talk. Thank you very much. And I don't suppose that I'm the only one here who will look at every individual tree a little differently now, for the thought that it might one day make up the 6 planks of my coffin. I shall be nicer to trees from now on. No, it was a fascinating talk, and while I was listening to it, I was thinking, as the chair of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, we often have a debate within the association about the balance between being literary critics and being activists. I was very struck, for example, that you were talking about the Kensington Gardens episode, and you mentioned W.H. Hudson, favourite writer of mine. Not everyone will know him, but he was a novelist, a naturalist, a prolific writer, a literary figure, but he was also the first president of the RSPB, and he knew very well, and writing in the example you gave there, that you couldn't preserve birds without the trees in which they live. So my question to you is that partly that question that always troubles us in ASLE, which is, how far should critics be activists, but also how far does reading Victorian literature like this impel us to action in our own time?
I mean, it's really tricky, isn't it? Because of course there needs to be activism because I want trees to be saved, but I'm first and foremost a literary critic, and I think especially with poetry, I would be very wary of recruiting poetry to a cause, to a political cause, because it's not didactic, and nor should it be. It is a way of making. It's a way of creating a little world in and of itself. And I think that if poetry can stand us in any stead, and I think it can, it's much subtler and much quieter than sort of a call to arms. I would hope that possibly some people might be inspired to plant trees as a result of these Victorian poems, but yes, there's some trees in the audience. But more than I think these poems are useful as a preventative more than they are for the promotion of something like activism or the planting of further trees. I think that because these poems take place in the present moment and force you to be there as a really horrific destructive act takes place, you are arrested and forced to think again. And I think probably that's the greatest thing that these poems can give us. It's sort of, I'm going to use an analogy here from mindfulness, that poetry is a bit like mindfulness, in that rather than what can we do in nature, I think the question is, how can we be in nature? So it's less about kind of what action can you take, because the problem is that when humankind takes action in nature, it tends to be pretty devastating. So maybe we need to learn to live within.
Yes, and you use the word value right at the end there, and I do wonder whether poetry helps us to value more and to love more, and we of course will work to protect what we love, and if poetry makes us love nature more, perhaps we will work to protect it more. I don't know whether that's something you would...
Yeah, I think so, for sure. And I think one of the really useful things that poetry does in a way that no other genre can is that it slows you right down. You cannot read it fast. You cannot move past this poem quickly, and hopefully that will mean you can't move past this one tree quickly.
I think as somebody who is an environmentalist, I found in some ways it very depressing that there have been people using a medium, and that's where poetry was such an important medium of speaking to a very large number of people, from the 16th and 17th century onwards, about the rape of trees. And yet we're seeing in many ways more of it when we know more and more about how many we need. And it just made me reflect in particular the use of the phrase ash die back, as though the ash is choosing to die back, rather than it being a symbol in so many ways of an extinction of a species because of a whole range of actions that we're taking.
Well, and maybe that's where poetry could be helpful again, because it's forcing you to look at the level of the individual word and its meaning, and therefore in these sorts of phrases that we come up with to slightly veil or clothe the destruction that's going on, you can't do that with readers of poetry because they're too well versed in sort of trying to actually read for the meaning.
That's right. Could we have the lights down and an opportunity for members of the audience to participate? There are 2 microphones. I just can't see anything at the moment, so I can't see where the microphones and the paddles are. But there's a question at the back, please.
Right in front.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the discussion and the depth of interpretation that you brought to the poetry, so thank you very much for that. My question really is developing from the conversation you started on the platform, which is that, in my personal view, is that the poems are actually quite political in their own way. That both, for example, Hopkins and Hardy were embodying a stance towards the world which was inherently moral, or in Hopkins' case, religious. And therefore, I'm thinking a bit more broadly about how we can adopt this same approach in the creative arts to our own situation nowadays. Thinking about what's happened with David Attenborough's programme and the way that creative exploration of an issue has led to action. I'm just wondering if there are any equivalent ways which we can bring that sense of urgency to the situation of trees.
I mean, I think in some ways it is still going on today, because there was, with the Sheffield felling, there's a horrendous felling that's been going on in Sheffield the past few years, and certainly that has brought out artistic responses. Certainly one person managed to delay a tree's fate by playing the cello in front of it. I mean, talk about art and activism. But yes, I think you're absolutely right that they are political poems. The reason I put the caveat in there is because I think too often we try and brush away 19th century verse about trees as nature poetry. And I mean, I used to be an English teacher, and the classic question was, "Oh, is it a nature poem? It's a poem about a tree." So I feel like we are fighting this battle. But one of the great things about these poems, I think, and poems that could be written today, maybe for Sheffield, is avoiding nostalgia. And the way to do that is to stick to the present moment. I think these poems, possibly with the exception of Hopkins, avoid nostalgia by being really rooted in the present moment and what is going on right now.
But I think one of the points about doing the lecture and the way we are doing it here in Hay is taking the opportunity for there to be a deeply academic, grounded pieces of work, and actually demonstrate that the fact it can speak to all of us. And it makes me want to go back and look at some of those poems again, because the kind of passion in the poem is the passion that you've also reflected in your choice of this.
Yeah.
I mean, why did you decide, oh lover of the favourite tree, why did you decide to do this in the context of the competition?
I mean, the honest answer is it would never occur to me to do anything else. The second I saw the advert for the competition, I just started thinking about these tree poems again. And I guess because I'm working on a 19th century project right now, so I am sort of thinking more about 19th century concerns, and definitely sort of environmental desecration is something that the project I work on is very interested in. So it all just started to cohere in my head. But I think one of the astonishing things about these poems, all of which are really old, is how angry they can make you right now.
I think that's a really important point. It's that I talked about love earlier, but that anger is just as important. And also I was thinking about your students not liking a nature poem, because sometimes nature poetry can come across as still life.
Yes.
But the poems you were looking at today were not still lives. They were moments. They were moments of movement. Often that movement was felling, but they were moments of movement and action that actually impel one to take action oneself. And I think that that's a different kind of nature poetry.
Yeah, well, so I think that one thing I hope we see more of in the current day and age is poetry that isn't about nature, but is almost to nature, is addressing nature, is engaging with nature. Because the thing is that people want to be in dialogue with the natural world. There was a wonderful article in The Atlantic a few months ago where in Australia they put, what do you call them, QR codes, no, email addresses, that was it, email addresses on every single tree with the idea that people could report damage or, you know, whatever had gone on. And what actually happened, which no one had intended, was they started receiving hundreds, thousands of love letters to the individual trees.
Oh, yes.
Read the article, it's astonishing. But that shows you how much people will to speak to trees and to say how much they value them in their daily lives.
Right, we have a question over there. Please, sir.
It's a comment or
Microphone.
It's a sort of comment and a thought, a reflection about the cross-cultural aspects of this as the Amazon disappears and so on. But I was just thinking about Australia.
Mm-hmm.
In the museum, an Aboriginal voice in Sydney, they have animated a walk amongst trees, and a voice from a tree says, "Why did I can't possibly caricature an Aboriginal way of expressing themselves? Why did you cut down our trees?" The white man, Governor Phillip, arriving in all his triumphalism. Why you cut down our trees? Our trees feel. And it also goes on to say, why you cut the earth for minerals? Why you cut the earth? Our earth's sacred, sort of. So there's a wonderful simplicity, but a sort of parallel with what you were saying, the depth of feeling that these people felt for these fellow creatures.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the mistake that we've been making for a long time is in thinking that nature is for us, rather than that we are a part of a shared project.
Yeah, it's interesting that we have, if you go back to Rio, 1992, the first principle of Rio is that human beings have the right to live in harmony with nature. The right to live in harmony with nature. Right, have you got somebody over there?
Yes.
Okay, at the back, and I think, do we have one over there as well?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll have two quick questions. Thank you.
First of all, a comment. Considering the vastness of forests, most trees are never seen by a human being until the day they're cut down. And the question is this: what is the most upsetting sight? A tree being cut down or a tree falling down and wrenching up great mounds of bedrock?
Thank you. Can we take the other question as well, please?
I'm still a teacher of English, and I wonder whether one reason why many, not all but many young people see nature poetry in a dismissive way and don't feel that anger is that actually they know very little about trees. Many young people I encounter can't tell you what an ash looks like or an elm. I once had to clarify in a book that elders was referring to trees and not to old people. And they were imagining a crowd of people, and in fact there was two characters in a wood. And I suppose my question is, what can individual parents and teachers do to bring young people back to an awareness of our ecology, but also perhaps what can wider society and the education system do?
In about 1 minute. Thank you.
Goodness. Okay. Right, crikey. On the first question, so I think it's always worse to see an individual tree, if we're talking about an individual tree cut into by human hands, whereas it sounded like in the other version a tree was falling naturally, and as it does that it takes down other trees, yeah? Okay, so the reason I would go with the human version is because that's our intervention that maybe we shouldn't have been doing in the first place, whereas at least if a tree falls in the forest and dies naturally, as long as you don't remove the dead tree carcass, the other trees can then feast on those nutrients. So I would go that way round on that question. Gosh, let's reform the education system in a minute. I mean, I definitely think that forest schools becoming much more broadly within the education system is a hugely important thing, and it's something that the UK have been quite slow to jump on the bandwagon with, and other Scandinavian countries have been with this for a while. There's a wonderful book called Last Child in the Woods. Yes, you've clearly read it. But yes, I think it is about getting outside. I mean, obviously that's difficult if you're in an urban environment, but if it's at all possible to have a lesson outside, to encourage parents to walk with their children to local woods, even just a single tree. And reading aloud, I actually think that rather than just advocating reading, I would say how different an experience it is to read aloud with your family outdoors. I think that might do more than just simply prescribing more reading, which is, you know, a standard path.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that goes to not just for school children, but at all levels. Even us university lecturers should take our students outside, and I do that on one of my modules, on my writing and environment module. I take students outside, but you can't believe just how many forms you've got to fill out, risk assessments. You've got just to take people on a walk to a park to look at some trees. It's astonishing, and perhaps that in itself tells us something about the way we've perhaps got our priorities a little bit skewed there. I'm going to say a little bit about to wrap up, but first of all, you know, I think that was a fabulous talk. Really enjoyed it, and I wish we could have more time for discussion, and we should all thank you together in a moment. But before we do, I just want to say thank you all for coming along. And as you probably heard, that this is a collaboration between the Hay Festival, between Inspire, and between ASLE-UKI. And I just want to conclude by saying that ASLE-UKI is an academic organisation. It's an association of university academics from across, we say the Atlantic archipelago, but we are the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. And in fact, we're part of an international movement. There are associations similar to us across the world in many countries. And we organise a conference. We had last year's in Orkney, and this year's will be in Plymouth. We take this Atlantic archipelago bit seriously. So it's mostly academics, but you're welcome to come along. We publish a journal, Green Letters, which comes out 4 times a year with the latest research in the environmental humanities and eco-criticism. And you can subscribe to that. You can become a member of ASLE-UKI. And the other thing we do is this. And every year we issue a call for entries to this competition, and it goes out mostly to academics, but also to creative writers. And we will be at some point in the autumn, probably in October or November, we shall be issuing that call. And you can find out more about us by going to our website, which is just put ASLE-UK into any search engine, and you will find us. That's enough about me. I'm going to finish by asking, by saying thank you again to Trinity, thank you again to Hay, but thank you especially to Catherine for such a fabulous and thought-provoking talk today. Thank you very much.
And can I finish by thanking you all for coming and participating. As another ex-English teacher who spent a number of years as Education Minister in Wales, my favourite headline ever was "Minister makes children play in the rain." So thank you very much indeed. Go and get your trees from the Woodland Trust and enjoy the fact we started with bark, spelled B-A-R-K, on this occasion. All right, bye all.